Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. I've got an exciting video today. We are going to talk about the ROG Flow Z13. The embargo just lifted on this. I've actually had it for a couple months, but I haven't been able to talk in terms of like numbers and stuff. And so now I can finally do that. And so that's what we're going to dive into here today. This thing is a Windows tablet / laptop hybrid, and we've seen these things before. I've even reviewed them on my channel. But what really separates this one from the others is it has the latest AMD APU called the Strix Halo, or the Max AI 395 is the official name, which is terrible. But what it really comes down to is that this thing is so much more powerful than any other APU we've seen before. I've been following this type of CPU with integrated graphics for about 3 or 4 years at this point because they are available inside of handheld PCs. And every year we see them just get a little bit better every single time. When it comes down to it, this APU can give you about 3 times the performance of last year's model of APU, which is a huge jump and something I've never seen before. It's a true generational leap. In fact, this thing can rival the discrete graphics cards that you will often find in laptops and high-end mini PCs. And so it's kind of amazing that something without a graphics card can get us this type of performance. But as you might expect, because this is the latest and greatest APU from AMD and it's debuting in the Flow Z13, and it's got the word AI in the title, and it's from ASUS, this thing has a heavy price tag. The starting price for the low spec model is $2,000, and it goes all the way up to $2,700 for the one that has 128 gigs of RAM. And so as you can imagine from the title of this video, this is not a tablet for mere mortals. You really have to know what you're getting into to even consider something like this. And I think for the rest of us regular folks, it's a really neat insight into what we're going to be seeing in the future because, like I said, this APU is kind of crazy. So even if you're not in the market for something this expensive, I think it's going to be really fascinating to see what type of performance we're going to be getting here in the future. So we've got a lot to unpack. Grab your favorite snack and drink and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, I hope you haven't started eating your snack and drink just yet because you're about to spit it out when we look at these prices. Let's take a look at all three. The one on the far right is the cheapest model, starting at $2,000, but bear in mind this one has a lower spec APU. It has the Ryzen AI Max 390, which only has 12 cores and 24 threads compared to 16 and 32 on the other spec models like the one I'm reviewing today. The one that I'm reviewing is on the far left. It is $2,200 on the ASUS website as well as on Best Buy right now, but I've heard that this might go up to $2,300, but this is what it's showing on the website right now. Either way, this one has the Ryzen AI Max Plus 395. In addition to the terrible name, it's also got 16 cores and 32 threads, and this particular SKU also has 32 gigs of RAM and a terabyte of storage. And like I mentioned, the middle tier is $2,700. It feels ridiculous even to say that number, but it's got 128 gigs of RAM if you would actually need that. As far as I can tell, this amount of RAM will probably not be of additional benefit when it comes to gaming. It's more for if you're going to be using it for AI related tasks, which we're not really going to cover in this video. So long story short, we are looking at about $2,200 to $2,300 for the device that I am reviewing today, which was sent over from ASUS. Now, to get our bearings in terms of price, let's look at all the various things that this might compete with when it comes to productivity as well as gaming. So let's start with the iPad Pro. We're going to do the 13-inch version, so it's about the same size. And then also I upgraded it to a terabyte of storage and then added the Magic Keyboard since the ROG Flow also comes with a keyboard as well. And surprisingly, the price is about the same when you look at the two of them, about $2,250 for the Apple model before making any additional upgrades. Now, I am the type of guy who actually does use fancy iPads. I've got the iPad Pro M2, and this one cost me quite a bit of money back when it was first launched, and I used to use this for all my audio recording here on this channel. And previously, I've owned like previous iPad Pros, and I've used them for things like video editing and audio recording and things like that too. And so I have gotten a lot of use out of an iPad, but even then, it's really hard to justify $2,250 for anything that an iPad can do. And so even if a similarly spec'd iPad Pro is about the same price as the Flow Z13, I think that says more about the utility of an iPad Pro and its ridiculous pricing versus the actual value compared to the Flow Z13. So let's go and do another angle. Now, I could talk about a MacBook Pro because this one is of a similar price as well, but I think it's kind of apples to oranges because you're not going to be able to do a lot of gaming on this one either, just like with the iPad. So instead, after looking around, about the closest equivalent I could find was also from ASUS. It's their Zephyrus G14. This one is a 14-inch OLED laptop, but has a dedicated graphics card inside, the RTX 4070. Even though it is using an older CPU, performance-wise when it comes to gaming, this should be about neck and neck with the Flow Z13 that we're reviewing today. And this one's about $2,000, so a little bit cheaper than the Flow Z13, and it's actually got a larger battery. It's 76 watt hours compared to 70. But also bear in mind that this laptop is just a laptop, so it's not going to be able to do those tablet-y things that we can do with the Flow Z13. And so when it comes down to it, there is no good comparison against the Flow Z13 on the market right now. This APU is one of a kind. You know, you could compare it against the Apple ecosystem because the specs and the pricing are about the same, but they do totally different things. On the Windows side, your closest comparison is going to be a laptop with discrete graphics card, but that's its own like ecosystem right there as well, and it obviously can't do tablet-y things. There are gaming-centered Windows tablets out there, like the Minisforum V3, which I reviewed on this channel. I'll leave it linked down below, and that one was like $1,500, but it is a third of the power of this thing right here. And so there is no good market value comparison on the market today to say whether or not this is going to be worth your money, just because there's nothing else out there that competes with it. So let's actually look at the specs and see whether or not just on its own, these are going to be worth considering. And I'm going to breeze through some of this stuff just because we've talked about it already. For example, we know the CPU is this Max Plus 395, and this one does come with 32 gigs of LPDDR5X RAM clocked at 8,000 megahertz. The storage in this is NVMe 2230, and it's 1 terabyte in the model I'm reviewing. Now let's talk a little bit more about the display because there are some interesting aspects here. Number one, it's 13.4 inches and has a resolution of 2560 by 1600. This is a 16 by 10 aspect ratio display, which means it's going to be a little bit taller than your typical 16 by 9. And it has a 180 hertz refresh rate, which is kind of overkill when it comes to PC gaming, but it's actually awesome when it comes to retro gaming. We'll talk about that later. Now the battery on this I think is a little bit small. It's 70 watt hours. Now that makes sense because it's a tablet. You don't have a whole chassis underneath like a laptop to be able to put a bigger battery in. But as we'll discuss throughout the rest of this video, battery life is probably my main concern with this thing altogether. In terms of weight, it is pretty heavy. It's about 1,200 grams or 2.5 pounds, which is, a little bit light when it comes to a laptop, but definitely heavy when it comes to a tablet. As far as connectivity, we've got the works, so Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 5.4, and it's also running Windows 11 Pro on this model. The cheaper tier will have Windows 11 Home. It's also got dual cameras, both on the front and back, and then also the keyboard attachment thing, which we'll talk about later. Now let's take a look at the Z13 itself and some of its I/O. Starting on the left side, we've got two USB 4 ports. These are full spec, so 40 gigabits data, and they can also accept a 100-watt charge from a USB. These are also DisplayPort out, which means that in combination with the HDMI 2.1 port here, we actually can have 3 video out signals going at once, which is crazy for a tablet. Below that, we've got a proprietary charging port. Let's take a look at the power supply. Okay, this is the power supply. It's a 200-watt power supply. It's actually kind of small when you compare it to like a laptop one, but still pretty big if you're going to be carrying this around. Now, thankfully, the port itself is interchangeable, so you can plug it in either way. You don't have to worry about plugging it in one specific way, which I found really handy. Now, you can still charge via USB, so you don't actually have to use this, but you'll get a warning in the software saying, hey, you're using a slow charger. You should use the one that came with your device. However, I didn't have any limitations in actual performance when using USB, and so yeah, it'll charge a little bit more slowly, but I found that it still allows me to play in turbo mode, which is kind of my favorite way to play this thing. And so the way I see it, if you are going to get the Flow Z13, I would just use the adapter at home and just kind of have it permanently there. You can plug it in when you're home, hook it up to a monitor or whatever. But then when you go on travel, you can probably just use a high-speed USB charger and you'll be fine. We've also got a micro SD card port. This is high-speed UHS 2. And then finally, near the bottom here, you can see we've got one of our 2 stereo speakers. And of note, there's a little cutout in the glass right here to help with the audio, so it doesn't quite come out of the sides. It kind of comes from like this whole area and actually sounds pretty nice. We'll do a sound test here in a moment. Now on our right side, we've got a power button as well as our volume up and down. And then this one brings up the command center. We'll talk about this when we get into software. Further down, we've got a USB-A 3.2 Gen 2 port. And honestly, this one is probably my favorite port among all of them. You never realize how much you want a USB-A port until you have one on a tablet, because this has been super handy. I mostly use it for like controller dongles, so I can just plug this in and immediately connect whatever controller I'm using, but obviously you could use it for like a USB mouse or like a hard drive. Below that, we've got our 3.5mm headphone jack, which are increasingly rare on tablets, thanks Apple, and then below that, we've got our other stereo speaker. So let's go ahead and do a quick audio test. I'm going to run Hades here at full volume. And at the end of the day, I think that the audio here is pretty good. It's not quite as bassy as I would like, and definitely doesn't have the presence of like a MacBook Pro, but still, I think it's pretty great audio, all things considered. On the top, we've got our exhaust vents, and then an ROG tag, and that's about it. And then on the bottom, we've got these pogo pins for the keyboard attachment. Before we talk about the keyboard, let's talk about the back. So we've got two fans right here, and then this little window right here, which actually shows the motherboard. And you can change the settings on this in the software. So you can make it rainbow like I have right here, or you can make it a solid color, or you can just turn off the illumination. It's all up to you. But I do like this little bit of gamery RGB. You know, ASUS always kind of puts this in their stuff, but I like the fact that this is kind of subdued when you think about it. We've also got a 13 megapixel camera. We'll test this out with the front camera here in a moment. The only other thing worth talking about is this kickstand, which I love. This thing is made out of metal, so it feels super sturdy, but then also has this little lip right here, so you can open it up like this, and you can go all the way 170 degrees. How awesome is that? And so you've got a huge range of angles right here, all the way from like, you know, your typical kind of tablet stand like this, all the way back if you wanted to actually use this for like productivity or gaming on it or something like that. There's just a lot of options. So I really like the fact that we have 170 degrees to work with right here, and it feels super sturdy. So I really appreciate this thing altogether. Now looking at the front, it's just your typical like slab tablet. We've got some pretty thick bezels on the top and bottom, but thinner on the sides. We have a ROG Flow logo right here on the bottom, and then we've got a 5 megapixel sensor camera right here. And it's an IR camera, and you can also sign into Windows with that. And so that's all I've been doing over the past couple of months, is basically signing in with my face. Now the front camera can also be used as a webcam. It's not going to be the greatest in the world, but I think it'll get by in terms of Zoom calls. The back camera definitely has a higher resolution to it, and if you want to be one of those people that, you know, takes pictures with their tablet, you can totally do that. I'm just not really sure how much utility the back camera is going to get. Okay, so now let's talk about the keyboard attachment. This thing is relatively thin and lightweight, and this thing will snap into place and also becomes the cover for your tablet. It's a magnetic connection, and it's actually super strong, so all I have to do is get it close, and like that, it's just going to be connected. Now, one interesting component is that the software knows when you don't have the keyboard attached, so it'll go into tablet mode, which is right here. So what'll happen is the taskbar will be larger, and then also when you pull up a window, it'll actually get smaller, so it kind of hides itself. But then if you plug in the keyboard, after a moment, it'll detect it. It'll even make like the USB sound. But after a little bit, it's going to make it smaller because it's going to know that you have the trackpad to work with. And so you can see there it just got a little bit smaller. And so it kind of goes between laptop and tablet mode, which is not something I expected. I really like that. Now for the keyboard itself, you can either just lay it flat on the table like I'm doing here, or it actually will go up like this. And so it kind of raises itself up. And this is the normal way that I've been using it most of the time. The lip here is not that big. You can see it's about maybe a ½ inch, but it does make it a lot more comfortable, and I think it's just an easier angle to work with. And so I like the magnetic snap right there. And the magnet here is so strong that you don't really have to do anything. As soon as you open this thing up, it's going to stay like this. And so really, if you want to have it flat on the table, that's when you have to pull it all the way. But otherwise, it's just going to naturally be like this. As far as the typing experience, it's about what you would expect. So it's got chiclet keys on it, so very low travel, and it's very similar to like the Magic Keyboard on the iPad Pro. So really no complaints when it comes to the keyboard in terms of just using it, because everything's just kind of standard size. It does have a Copilot button if you're into AI stuff, but for the most part, I've just been using it like a regular keyboard, and then I have the function button right here for other tasks like being able to make it brighter. Now the function keys are pretty standard, but the one that I've been using the most is F5. So this one essentially is your performance mode. So you can change this between like silent and performance mode and turbo mode by just pressing the FN button and then this at the same time. So super handy. The keyboard is actually backlit, and you can change the different colors in it in the software, and you can also use the function keys to adjust the brightness or just turn the lighting off. And this is as bright as the keyboard keys get in full brightness, so they're actually pretty subdued even when they're at max. Now the trackpad, like with the keyboard, is just fine. I've got no problems with it. It's pretty responsive. I'm able to tap it or do a full click. I can obviously also just use the touchscreen if I'd like as well, one of the nice things about having a tablet like this. And it's also got like multi-point touches as well. Okay, so putting all the hardware together in terms of the I/O and all the functionality of it, let's talk about what it's like to use it as a tablet as well as a laptop. Now, for the most part, I've been using this as a laptop replacement, and one of the things that I've found it excels in is actually using it on my lap. A lot of modern gaming laptops suffer from the fact that they get really hot because all of the power is happening in the underside chassis. But the Flow Z13 is an opposite experience because all of the power is happening above your legs. Now it is a little bit awkward because, that kickstand is going to be resting on your legs, so it doesn't feel quite as sturdy as a full-on laptop, but I've made it work pretty easily. And I love that it's a super cool feeling, literally, because all of the heat is blowing away from you. And, you have the keyboard attachment on your lap itself, which doesn't get hot at all, doesn't generate any power. And so this has been actually a really excellent experience. So even though it is a less sturdy experience, I've managed to make it work over the past couple months with no problem. Now, as a tablet, I think it gets the job done, but the cracks start to show as you use it. The first is that it's quite heavy. It's 1,220 grams without the keyboard attachment. That makes it about 500 grams heavier than my M2 iPad Pro, and I think the M4 is even lighter. So it definitely is a beefy tablet, and I'm constantly reminded as I use it in tablet mode that it's really just a laptop without the keyboard. So I could definitely see myself using this to watch movies or something on an airplane, but I think that just around the house, if I had an iPad, I would rather use that. So if anything, I would classify this entire setup as being more travel-friendly than a laptop, but less travel-friendly than a tablet. It kind of fits in that middle ground between overall weight and size, and so it does a pretty good job in both categories, but not stellar in either. Okay, before we talk about the software and do our performance testing, let's talk a little bit more about this screen. Like I mentioned, it's 180 Hz, but it's also variable refresh rate and FreeSync compatible. That means that anything from 48 to 180 Hz is going to be very smooth on this display. As far as coloring and saturation, I found it to be really good. Now, I'm not really sure in terms of like photo editing and things like that, but it does have 100% DCI-P3. Personally, I'll say that I can definitely tell that it's not OLED, but as far as LCDs go, I think it's rather impressive. As far as the brightness and dimness levels, it does get pretty dim, but nothing that's crazy. And then also in terms of brightness, same thing, where it gets pretty bright, more than I would typically need, but still I wouldn't want to play this like outdoors. The screen is also quite reflective, but that's pretty typical for any of these tablets. I mean, even my iPad is super reflective, although this one does have a tempered glass cover on it. For the most part, I've just been playing at about 75% brightness, and that has worked out well for me when playing it indoors. Now let's talk about software, and this is going to be your typical Windows experience. So, you can plug it in with the laptop attachment and just use it like that, or you can use it like a kind of touchscreen tablet, which is never great with Windows, but it gets the job done. Now, ASUS does have their own front-end software, Armory Crate, and you can access it by pressing the sidebar button. This will give you some quick settings that you can also adjust in the software, and you've got Armory Crate, and then also you can bring up what they call operating mode. These are your different power profiles, and mostly on battery, you'll just go between silent and performance, and then when you have it plugged in, you can go into turbo, which is really going to max out the power. There's also a manual toggle, but I didn't go too deep in the weeds with my testing because I wanted to keep it like an out-of-box experience. So we just used silent, performance, and turbo. Now, within the Armory Crate software, this is where you can jump in and monitor everything that's going on. You can change out your operating mode here, and you can also do things like go into your system settings. So here's where I go to change out like the back panel lighting. I have it set to rainbow. They've also got like their Aura Sync, which is like their RGB lighting adjustments. And you can even go in and actually browse your game library. So if you've got multiple front ends other than just like Steam, you can launch your games from here instead. Within the settings cog, you can go into the update center. This is going to show you whether or not you need to like update your BIOS. You can see here that I'm supposed to update my Aura wallpaper app. So I'll definitely get on that. Also on the front page, if you tap on the My ASUS logo, that'll bring up the My ASUS app. And so this will be different system updates. And so you can see here, I have a bump LED firmware update that I should do as well. So in general, like with the ROG Ally, you've got like 3 different ways that you can update your system, either through Armory Crate or My ASUS, or then also obviously just your regular Windows updates too. And honestly, that's about it when it comes to the software. There's not much you can change. You've just got your performance modes that you can toggle right up here. And really, that's about all I've been doing within Armory Crate. I personally wish that we had more robust options like I have on the ROG Ally X. This command center lets me change out my performance profiles, but I can also change the screen resolution, the screen refresh rate, and also add a frames per second limiter. Another handy feature is that you can turn on and off your CPU boost, which is really handy with certain low-end games. And so it is kind of crazy to me that the same company has different softwares for things that are very, very similar. It looks to me like they're using laptop-style software right here, but I think that handheld software like this, especially the ability to change the resolution and refresh rate on the fly, are kind of a must-have for a tablet like this. The problem with this tablet is not the power. Like, it has plenty of power to be able to play all your favorite games. The issue is that there's not enough things to actually reduce the power. I think that the power management could be better on the lower end. And I think having quick software options to change out your resolution and refresh rate and even turn off some cores would be really handy with this tablet, but unfortunately they're not there yet. Okay, now that we've talked about software, let's jump into benchmarks and talk about what the Flow Z13 can really do. Now, I personally don't do a lot of benchmarking. I like to do a lot of real-world tests, but part of my benchmarking testing is to check out the temperatures and see how everything fares. And generally what I will do is a CPU-intensive multi-core benchmark, like Cinebench, just to see how hot it'll get over that 10-minute period. And I found the temperatures to be pretty low considering that this is a relatively thin Windows tablet. I found it capping out at about 80 degrees Celsius while running Cinebench. Now, when running GPU-intensive games, especially something that would run it at about 90% or higher on the GPU, then I did see it getting a little bit hotter. For example, with Doom Eternal at 1600p and Nightmare settings, I was seeing the temperatures rise up to about 84 degrees Celsius at the max. There were a couple other games where I saw it get up to maybe like 86, but I never saw it really get past that, so that was the worst that I saw in terms of temperatures. And I think those are pretty typical temperatures when it comes to laptops, so I'm not super surprised by these results. Now, another important thing for me are ambient temperatures. I hate it when the thing that I'm holding gets super hot, so I also tested that. On the screen itself, it's not that bad. It's about 37 degrees Celsius, which is the same as human body temperature, so it's about the same temperature as your hands. But on the back, it does get hotter, in the low 40s, and I found that right in the very center, it was about 44 degrees Celsius, so that's about 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And so this part right here gets a little bit warm, like 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's definitely the warmest part of the machine when it's really running. But if I was to pick a place on a laptop or a tablet to get really hot, I think that's probably where I'd pick it too, because you just never really touch this spot. If you think about it, if you're playing like a heavy duty game, you're never going to hold it like this and play it. You're going to prop it up and then have it away from you. And that's the furthest place from you when you're playing a game, because it's going to be here on the back of the screen. If you think about a typical laptop, all the heat is going to be on the bottom. And when you're holding it on a table or whatever, all that heat's going to be pretty close to your face if you're looking at the screen. This is the opposite, where the keyboard attachment itself doesn't get hot at all. It doesn't generate any heat. It's really going to be all back here where you don't really care. And so in terms of thermals, yeah, it's your typical laptop temperatures, but they're located in a place that doesn't really affect you in the day-to-day. And so that's probably what I would say is a benefit of using a tablet laptop hybrid like this. By the way, if you are the type of person that follows Cinebench scores, here is a quick look at them right here. Now, outside of actual game testing, the only other benchmark that I really run is going to be a GPU-related benchmark, and I like to use 3DMark's TimeSpy. Now, because we have three main power profiles with the software, Turbo, Performance, and Silent, I did run it 3 times. And honestly, the performance in all 3 modes was really impressive. Let's start with the Turbo results, which were over 10,000. That is like Dragon Ball Z levels of crazy. To put this into context, your typical handheld PC running at max is going to give you somewhere between like 3,000 and 3,500. I think that the latest test that I got with the Ally X was 3,543. So this benchmark is nearly 3 times the score of the ROG Ally X at max performance. To put it into further context, I've done a lot of eGPU tests on this channel. So this one here is the 1X eGPU, the first one. So it's a 7600M XT inside of it, which is a laptop GPU. And this thing is like $800 or whatever it is. And this gives me about a 9,000 3DMark score with TimeSpy. So this thing is actually worse than the tablet that we have right here. So the combination of a mini PC or a handheld PC plus a discrete graphics card like this one is still worse than the tablet that we're reviewing here today. So that's our score when it comes to turbo mode, which means it has to be plugged in first. Let's try the next one, which is performance mode, which is the best performance you can get in the stock software when you have it unplugged. And I was surprised to see that this one is not far off from the turbo mode. It's actually 9,153. And again, this is about the same as a handheld PC and eGPU combination. And so now let's try out the silent mode, which is the lowest power profile that you can use in the software right now. Now, personally, I think this mode is too powerful and it needs to be ratcheted down, but you can see that these scores really speak for themselves. So here I got a TimeSpy score of 6890, which again is about double of your handheld PCs right now. So let's put that into context. That means that this tablet in its lowest power profile mode is still twice as powerful as a handheld PC in its highest power profile. And so this is what I meant when I said that there's an actual generational leap in this thing compared to previous devices, because it really does play just about anything you can throw at it. And before we jump into the actual performance testing, let's do one quick sound test of the fan noise. So here I am running it in silent mode. I've got a lot of ambient noise in the studio because I've got a huge window and a bunch of traffic on the other side of it. And so just overall, my dB is about 40 decibels altogether. And at this point, I can't hear the fan going off at all. In fact, once it gets to a certain temperature threshold, it just turns the fan off completely and lets passive cooling take care of the rest. And pushing it up to turbo mode and running a high-end game will make the fan noise a lot more audible, so about 55 dB here in the studio. Now, it's really hard to capture the profile of fan noise, but I would say that this is definitely a more whooshing feeling, no sort of whine for me. And so in general, I can definitely hear this, but it does seem to be less than typical gaming laptops and is overall a pretty pleasant sound. Okay, we've been going for a while now. We haven't even talked about gaming performance yet, so let's jump into that. And like I mentioned before, I've had this for about 2 months and I've done all sorts of testing with it. So let me walk you through just kind of the things that I've really enjoyed about it and some of the things that leave me scratching my head. Let's start with the really good stuff, which is basically any time that you plug this device in, because when you're using it in turbo mode, it is really excellent. For just about every single game that I want to play, I can generally play it at the native resolution, so 1600p, and it's still going to play at a really high frame rate. For example, with Destiny 2 at 1600p and medium settings, it'll go anywhere from like 80 to 120 frames per second. And because this is variable refresh rate, the entire experience to me feels very smooth. And so this has been one of my favorite gaming experiences, bar none. I really love Destiny 2, and the fact that I can play it at 1600p medium settings and a high refresh rate is kind of amazing. And so that's usually my standard settings when it comes to playing a game when plugged in, because I'm using that turbo mode at that point. So I'll just set it to 1600p in medium settings and then adjust it from there. And as long as it gets over 48 frames per second, the VRR is going to kick in, which makes it a really smooth experience. For some games, I did find that 1600p is a little bit much, and so for example with Returnal, which is a very GPU intensive game, I found the best experience for me was 1200p medium settings. It still looks really good, but it's not going to be quite at that level of crispness that you might be used to. But I should also mention, because this is a brand new APU, I have been running into issues here and there. For example, the latest update to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth basically made my characters disappear. I have no idea what's really going on here, but I thought that was pretty funny. To be fair, the OEM drivers that are packaged on this device right now are actually older than their launch of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and so it's kind of surprising that it ran in the first place because there is no optimizations for it right now. So long story short, this is one game I have not been able to play since the latest update. Now, beyond just the typical 1600p medium settings that I've been able to play when plugged in, I also wanted to talk about just what it's like when you unplug it and actually play with battery. We're not going to do a full battery life chart in this video. Instead, I'm just going to integrate the battery stats as we go through the rest of the section. So for example, here with Cyberpunk 2077, I'm playing this at 1600p medium settings, but I'm using it unplugged and in performance mode. In order to stick to an average that was going to be over 48 frames per second, I did turn on FSR 3. I think this is one of those games that actually does well with resolution upscaling, so I think it still looks really good. However, you can see here that with performance mode, it is pulling a lot of weight to the point where it's actually pulling over 70 watts, which means that we're getting less than 1 hour of battery life. For example, in this scenario, you can see that I'm getting 58 minutes total. Here's another example, God of War Ragnarok. I've been playing this one and enjoying it a lot on this tablet as well. Again, 1600p medium settings when plugged in has been the optimal experience for me. No resolution upscaling at all. Now, unplugged, I had to scale it back a little bit, did FSR 3 balance, so the graphics are a little bit softer, but still very playable. And you can see here that when in performance mode, I got a little bit over an hour, so definitely not really great. If anything, I've been thinking about this in that I would play this in short bursts if I have just an hour to kill, but for anything else, I would want to have it plugged in. And this is kind of the typical use case that I've seen with these AAA title games, so like Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. Here I'm running it 1600p medium settings, no problem, everything looks great, but it's plugged in. Once I put it into performance mode, I'm going to have to enable FSR to be able to keep those high frame rates, and it is going to make the battery dip quite a bit, so about 55 minutes with this game. One more example, this is going to be Control. Again, 1600p medium settings and everything is running well. Again, well over 48 frames per second, which gives me that nice smooth gameplay. And once again, if we unplug it and then go into performance mode, we will get about an hour of battery life. This thing can take up to 70 watts or even more. Now, other than just jumping into performance mode, we can also try out these silent modes. Let's do a comparison here with Doom Eternal. Here, going 1600p with nightmare settings gives me over 100 frames per second. It's a wonderful experience. And unplugged, you can still get some pretty decent performance even in silent mode. And so this time I kept it at 1600p, but dropped it down to high settings and then put it into silent mode. This still gave me an average well over 60 frames per second and about double the battery life, so an hour and 42 minutes here. So it'll really depend on the game that you're playing and what kind of performance metrics you're looking for in terms of refresh rate and resolution, but for many games, silent mode works just fine. For example, with Rise of the Tomb Raider, 1200p medium settings here, silent mode again, and I can get a little bit over 60 frames per second and about an hour and a half of battery life, so quite a bit better than using performance mode. Same thing with Witcher 3, 1600p medium settings, silent mode here, in about an hour and a half. So when it comes to playing your high-end or intensive PC games, I think you've got a lot of room to work with. You can either try playing things in silent mode and then tweak your settings to get about an hour and a half to 2 hours of battery life. Or if you've got an hour or less to kill, then using something like performance mode can allow you to use higher-end settings and still get some really excellent performance, way beyond what you would expect with other APUs. But again, you're only going to get about an hour or less of playtime. Now let's talk about the other end of the spectrum when it comes to playing in silent mode, and that's going to be, the low end or indie type games. How much battery life can we get when we're playing something lightweight? Let's start with Celeste here. So this one is at 1600p default settings, although the max resolution of this game is 1080p, and it also will not go beyond 60 frames per second. So this is an ideal test case because it really doesn't push the device very hard. And you can see here that it gets about 5.5 hours of gameplay time, so I would consider this to be a best case scenario. Let's try a couple more games. So let's go over to Parking Garage Rally Circuit. This one can run at 1600p high settings, and it can get about 5 hours of battery life, which I think is pretty impressive considering the higher resolution. Even some games with a 3D engine, like Sulaco here, which is based off of GZ Doom, this one can run at 1600p medium settings, and I can get about 3.5 hours of battery life, which I think is still going to be pretty good depending on where you're going to use it. Another one of my favorite indie games right now is Prince of Persia Lost Crown. This is a really great Metroidvania, and this one at 1600p medium settings can give you about 2.5 hours of battery life. So it's still not super good. I wish that it was a little bit better, but at least it's about the same length as watching a movie. However, there were some other games where I felt it was just pushing it way too hard than what it needed. For example, with like Octopath Traveler 2, 1600p medium settings here, and this was running about as hard as like a AAA game. So this game was running at a full 27 watt TDP, which is the upper range of the silent mode, which I think is just tuned too high. I would much rather see something around the 18 watt instead. So when it comes down to it, the performance profiles are tuned a little bit high for my tastes, and I think that the battery life is suffering as a result. We've got a 70 watt hour battery to work with, but games like Octopath Traveler should be able to play for more than 1 hour and 40 minutes. Now, even though I think most people looking into this device are going to be interested in PC gaming, I did want to touch a little bit on emulation. The number one thing I wanted to talk about is that this is a 180Hz screen, which is going to scale correctly for 60Hz content like retro games. This allows us to go into the video settings and turn on shader subframes for 180Hz. From there, we can use the CRT Beam Simulator shader, which is going to give us really nice motion clarity, and then we can combine that with a CRT shader, which is going to make everything look nice and retro. So here I am playing with the CRT Geom Deluxe shader plus that CRT Beam shader, and it looks amazing. It's really hard to capture this on video, but if you are into retro gaming and you want to mimic a CRT screen, this actually works really well. Now, in terms of emulation power, this thing is going to run anything you can throw at it. For example, here's God of War 3. This is a PS3 game. I'm running it at a 2x resolution upscale, which is going to be 1440p, which is the max that this screen can handle because this is a 16:9 game. And so essentially I'm pushing the pixels as far as they can go in one of the hardest PS3 games to run on the platform. And you can see here that I'm hovering between 50 and 60 frames per second, and that's going to be a super smooth experience. Basically, any anything over 30 frames per second is going to be very playable on this game, and because we're at over 48 frames per second, it's going to kick in that VRR as well, and so this is a super smooth experience, really enjoyable. Another thing I mentioned before, this thing has a full HDMI port, so you could use this as a docked PC as well, plugged into a larger monitor. So here I am playing Ghost of Tsushima at 1440p medium settings and using this plugged into an external monitor. And this level of performance is really impressive, to the point where I could see people buying this as a replacement for a mini PC. Essentially, you can take it around and use it as a laptop or tablet depending on what you're doing, and then once you get home you can just plug it in and use it as your main computer as well. Now, I was also lucky enough to get 2 different versions of this device sent over for testing. They both have the same chipset, but one is pre-production and one is an early release. And ASUS was kind enough to let me hold on to both of them so I could do some specific testing. And as you can imagine, the number one thing I wanted to do was to try out a Linux operating system to see if we could get a SteamOS style experience. So on one computer, I left it with Windows, and on the other one, I installed Bazzite, and I tried that out as well. Now, I didn't have high hopes for Bazzite just because this is a brand new APU, and as far as I know, the team does not have their hands on it either, and so nothing has been optimized for this chip just yet. And that was immediately clear once I started messing around with Bazzite on the Flow Z13. For example, even though I can go into SteamOS and adjust things like my refresh rate, some of these didn't actually work correctly. For example, I couldn't put in a 60 frame rate cap. If I set that, it would actually go down to 45. So I had to hover between 45 and 90 frames per second in all of my testing unless the game itself was locked at 60. I also found that the power profiles did not work in the way that they're probably intended to work. For example, running Balatro in the power save mode within Bazzite actually gave me worse performance than Windows by far. This thing was pulling a full 22 watts from the system just to play Balatro. It's crazy. Now, the Windows performance was not great either. I got a little bit over 4 hours, but still, you would think that a Linux distro like this would be a lot more power efficient. In fact, that's what I found across the board. In silent mode and Windows, I would get better battery life than the power save mode within Bazzite. A more stark contrast was playing videos like streaming Netflix between Windows and Bazzite. On Bazzite, I could watch a movie for 3 hours and 4 minutes, which is just enough to actually watch one movie on a full charge. And bear in mind that I'm just running the 1080p version of Netflix. I don't pay for that extra stuff. On the other hand, within Windows, I got nearly 11 hours of playback on Netflix, and so I would say that there's a huge difference here when it comes to low-powered gaming and video watching. And this really just comes down to timing. I think that the Bazzite team has made a wonderful Linux distribution. In fact, it's one of the main things I use on my ROG Ally X. And so I do think that Linux and Bazzite may be an ideal solution in the future, but at least not right now. And you also have to bear in mind that I would rather use a tablet within the Windows operating system than within Linux. Now, obviously, Windows is not optimized for the tablet experience, but I would say that Linux is less optimized than Windows in that regard. And so in summary, yes, you can run Bazzite on this device, but I wouldn't really recommend it, at least right now. Okay, I think we have basically looked at every nook and cranny that we can with the Flow Z13, so let's go ahead and start wrapping up. Let's talk about what I like and what I don't like about it. As always, we'll start with what I like, and I am so impressed with the amount of power that we have here with integrated graphics. Especially when you put it in turbo gaming mode, we're looking at about 3 times the performance that I was getting in just the last generation of APUs. I also think that we have a very good screen. It's a 16:10 aspect ratio, which makes it great for 4:3 gaming, like with retro games, but then also allows for a variety of different aspect ratios within PC gaming as well. The 180Hz refresh rate is kind of overkill when it comes to PC gaming, but when it comes to retro gaming, it's awesome. I also can't say enough good things about the stand that they have on this tablet. I love the fact that it's built into the tablet itself and it goes back 170 degrees. This allows me to put it at basically any angle that I would ever need, and so I've really enjoyed that aspect. I also think that the keyboard is pretty decent. Like, it's not to the point of replacing an actual keyboard or even something on a laptop, but I've never really had any complaints over the past 2 months. Now, like always, this thing is not perfect, so let's talk about some of the things I don't like about it. Number 1 is the power management. I think that it is tuned too high. It's really impressive how much gaming we can get at the performance and silent modes, but I wish there was another really low powered option as well. When it comes down to it, when I was playing lightweight games, it was taking up way too much power, so I want the ability to disable some cores or potentially just have a really low power setting. And regardless of what performance mode that I used, I got a ton of battery anxiety the moment that I unplugged this thing, unless I was like streaming a movie. It really got to the point where as soon as I unplugged it, I just made a mental note that I had about an hour before I ran out of battery, and that's not a really good place to be. And I think that if they do add a really low power management profile, that will help some of that battery anxiety, because I'm not really pushing AAA games on the go all the time. I really just want to be able to play lightweight games for, 5 or 6 hours, and I think it's totally doable with a 70 watt-hour battery. The device also has a relatively large power supply. Now, that's pretty typical when it comes to gaming laptops, but considering that this is a tablet, I would want it to be more travel-friendly. Thankfully, you can charge it via USB up to 100 watts, but it is a little bit annoying that Windows and the ASUS software constantly remind you that you're using a low-powered solution. So if anything, I would categorize it like I did earlier, in that if you're going to be home, use the power supply. If you're going to be going on travel, then you can probably get by with a USB-C port. And finally, probably the biggest downside of this entire experience is going to be that price tag, because it does cost at least $2,000, but upwards of $2,700 depending on the spec you get. And I think this price point just eliminates a lot of potential customers because it is so high and there are other things you can get that are going to give you a great gaming experience for less. And when it comes down to it, if you do have $2,000 to spend on a travel-friendly gaming experience, then I have a really hard time recommending this over just a typical gaming laptop with a discrete graphics card. And make no mistake, it is amazing that an APU can get us this type of performance, but if you're going to be spending $2,000, does it really matter if you have discrete graphics or an APU at that point? It all really comes down to personal taste. If you plan on using it in some sort of tablet fashion, then obviously this is the best tablet that you can buy right now, and if you want to also use it like a laptop, you can do that as well. However, if you're just happy with the laptop experience, then I think you can get more bang for your buck looking out for sales for current laptops. At the end of the day, I think that the ROG Flow Z13 is an amazing piece of kit, and it's a really incredible look at what we're going to see in the future when it comes to integrated graphics. I really can't wait to see what other sorts of devices we're going to find with these Strix Halo chips, because I think that a mini PC that's not going to be hampered down by battery life is going to be amazing. I think that a really nicely tuned handheld PC with this type of power, even at low wattages, is going to be crazy too. I think the only major flaw of the Z13, other than that high price point, is the tuning and the overall mobility of the device itself. It really begs the question of why they put such a powerful and power-hungry chip that's tuned so high into a mobile-friendly setup that only has a 70 watt-hour battery, because those are not really adding up for me. And my number one advice is to make a super low powered mode, like cut off a bunch of cores, make it like 18 watt total TDP, and that's actually going to be a really good balance for something like this. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. I can't wait to read all those comments that say that this thing is way too expensive. I get it, this thing is super high priced, but it is also a really cool sneak peek at what things are going to look like a year or two from now. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.